Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Real Science Exchange, the pubcast where leading scientists and industry professionals meet over a few drinks to discuss the latest ideas and trends in animal nutrition. We've seen many advancements in genetics from both the animals we feed and the crops we grow. Tonight, we're going to take a deep dive into swine genetics and the role that nutrition plays in helping maximize those benefits. Hi, I'm Scott Sorrell, one of your hosts here at the Real Science Exchange. As global population surges and we look to do more with less while improving industry sustainability, genetic selection is playing a pivotal role. Tonight, we start with a look at the genetic advancements taking place in the swine industry and the impact those advancements have on all other parameters. To help us dig into those topics, we welcome Dr. Tom Rathje from DNA Genetics. Tom, welcome to the exchange.
Thank you.
As most of our audience knows, our discussions take place here in a virtual pub. So with that theme in mind, what are you drinking tonight, Tom?
You know, I've got a Diet Pepsi tonight, Scott, but I wish I had a Michter's with me right now. So I may have to follow up on that.
Well, I know that Steph ordered the Michter's. Unfortunately, it hasn't arrived yet, but we will promise. The mail is not what it used to be. I'm not sure what's going on with that.
That's right.
So I notice also that you've brought a guest with you. Would you mind introducing him?
Yeah, I'd love to. Dr. Jason Schneider is with us today. He's a nutritionist on our team at DNA Genetics. Maybe Jason, let you say a few more words about yourself. You'll do a better job than I can. So.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Obviously, my name's Jason. I'm a nutritionist by training on the DNA technical service team. I've been with DNA for about 4 years here now. And then some of my background really as growing up was on a typical diversified crop livestock farm in eastern Iowa. And really just liked the nutritional area of raising pigs and cows and how all that interacted with the crops. And then from there, I went to finish my undergraduate at Iowa State University, my master's at Oklahoma State University, and then finished up with my PhD at Kansas State University. So spent some time within the feed company nutrition world, as well as with a production company in Northeast Iowa, and then moved on to DNA here, where I work with a lot of our customers in the field in the U.S. and Canada.
Super. Well, it's a pleasure meeting you, Jason, and welcome to the exchange.
Thank you.
And in keeping with our theme, so what are you drinking tonight?
I have a Paulander beer. So
nice.
Usually I'm kind of a Busch Light guy 90% of the time, but I figure this could be something special. So
Splurging. Good. Appreciate it. Tonight, my co-host is Dr. Zach Lohman. Zach's Balchem's monogastric technical service lead, and he's joined us here before here at the exchange a few times. So welcome back, Zach, and tell us what you're drinking and any story that goes along with that.
I'm actually drinking Fruit Smash. They're kind of a light seltzer. It was 70 here in North Carolina last week. And so we got something to drink on the front porch, but it was 25 this morning. So not quite the right weather for it.
Yeah, I understand. Well, I'm going with an old standby. I've got a Woodford's Reserve tonight. I've kind of gotten into a bit of a rut. Been traveling a lot. Haven't had a chance to get to the state store, but we'll remedy that here coming up this weekend. So maybe I'll have something different next week.
Tonight's pubcast stories are brought to you by the Keysure line of chelated minerals. Keysure and Keysure Plus deliver proven and consistent bioavailability to maximize performance, and a no-frills pricing approach for greater profitability. Visit balchem.com to learn more.
Let's get started. Tom, can you give us a brief rundown of the traits that have advanced the most within the swine industry, and why are those characteristics important?
Yeah, so in the webinar that we did last week, I focused in on kind of two separate areas in pig genetics. One was the reproductive side, and then, of course, the advancements we made in the terminal pig. And I think if we kind of think of those two buckets, I guess some things that really come to the forefront for me, if we look at our sow lines, we've made a tremendous amount of progress in the industry for pig's wean. And historically, that was done largely by selection for total born, improving litter size. But certainly what the industry has recognized is that we can't blindly just chase litter size. We end up with some consequences to that, things like smaller birth weight pigs, lower survivability. So your return on improving litter size from selecting that way, I think, diminishes over time, certainly has in our program. So we took a hard look at that and really are focused now more on weaning the pigs we already are producing by putting more emphasis on pig quality, reducing pre-weaning mortality, and focusing on sows that have the ability to wean and raise a very heavy pig at weaning. So we've shifted our focus and really, have made some tremendous strides in those areas, particularly on birth weight. In the last 3 or 4 years, we've been able to have a significant impact there. Our average birth weights are up nearly 0.2 pounds, which is very significant when you're considering, a 2.9 or 2.8 pound pig. That's a big improvement. So we're nearly at 3 pounds now and a little bit over. So that has a huge impact on survivability. But it's changing the sow, obviously. So now we have sows today, and we've got some commercial data that would show this, that even over the last 6 years, they're weaning 1.5 more pigs and actually producing another 36 pounds of weaning weight in a given year. So, the question becomes, how do we extract that genetic potential from both a management and nutrition standpoint? Which is a constant challenge, I think, for the industry. If we think about the terminal side, then obviously most terminal sire lines have been focused on efficient lean growth, and ours is really no different. So tremendous progress over the years in feed efficiency. We're moving at about 4 units a year in feed efficiency. Growth is, of course, improving. All of those things combined have certainly changed the nutritional needs of the pig. And I would say also, I would add in that the sow has a strong contribution to that as well. So half of the index in our sow lines is based on terminal traits of lean efficiency. So we're seeing all these changes, and I think all of that combined is certainly brings in the expertise or the need for expertise from nutrition and management, and how do we extract that full potential.
So you mentioned change, and during your webinar, you talked a lot about the fact that change has accelerated here in recent years. Can you kind of talk through what some of those factors are?
Yeah, so probably the biggest one is the adoption of genomic selection that is pretty much in widespread use today. So over the last decade, that's become pretty mainstream for the industry. And what genomic selection does is it improves the accuracy with which we identify superior animals. So genetic advancement in livestock is really about deciding who gets to reproduce. And so when you make those decisions on which animals are retained, you want that decision to be right. And we try and make the right decision based on collecting performance data on the pigs and then predicting their breeding value. Before genomics, we would, of course, use information from relatives of animals. So your brothers tell you something about a pig, and your sisters, your mother, your father, your cousins, all of that information can be brought to bear on improving the accuracy of knowing what your performance level is from a genetic standpoint. What genomics does for us is that instead of assuming kind of an average relationship, let's say with your siblings of 50%, genomics allows us to very accurately estimate the true relationship on the DNA level. And that increased accuracy will make our decisions that much better when we're deciding replacements. So our speed of progress has increased anywhere from 25 to over 40% compared to what it was a decade ago. And I think the implication of that for the industry is that we need to really be ready to adapt and change to that that animal faster than we ever have been before. And it's not unique to pigs. I think it's true in poultry. It's true in the dairy industry. All of the different species now, things are moving fast. So, we're going to have to update nutritional specs, other things on a faster rate as well because of that.
So I think that's a great
Yeah, we
segue to
really-
a question for Jason. Yes, go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, I mean, we start looking at customer closeout data, and you really see that over the years from a terminal side, just what these animals will just flat out gain when they're healthy and in a good environment. It's actually quite phenomenal, just what the capabilities that they have. You just kind of wonder what the future is going to hold as we get to improve and bring up those, kind of shift that bell curve to the right even more and bring up maybe some of those tail enders that would have been a coal pig 5 years ago, and now they're going to be, full value pig. So I think the future really looks up when we look at genomics and see what we can bring to the producers in the field.
So what kind of adaptations have you had to make due to this rapidly evolving pig, if you will, Jason, from a nutritional perspective?
Yeah, like Tom said, we're the genetic change is speeding up. So it used to be where we might look at lysine requirements once every 5 years or so and make a change there. Where we're starting to think that we need to do that and look at that maybe every 2 to 3 years and make some updates. That they might be minor updates as well, but we're seeing a higher improvement in lean gain while still having high growth rates. So, that changes just what these pigs need from a lysine standpoint for optimal performance. Obviously, for best cost can be a little bit different in the field, and that's kind of what I deal with on a producer by producer in different region standpoint, because the best gain doesn't always mean best return or best cost. So we kind of have to play that right, or you got to take that with a grain of salt. But as these pigs are growing faster, we're just trying to keep up on what do they need, so we're not lagging behind.
And so you mentioned lysine. What about sorry, Zach, what about other amino acids? As these pigs grow faster, more efficiently, are we finding other amino acids that are now limiting?
Well, I think as these diets become more purified and more crystalline amino acids are available in the marketplace and more affordable, the big question is what's the next limiting amino acid? We're able to, in some places, put crystalline valine in some diets, and that's you're at 4 or 5 crystalline amino acids in some of these diets, and you might have a pretty purified diet at that point. And so right now we're kind of looking at branch chains amino acids and how that affects intake and growth rate, especially with different ingredients. And that's the big caveat: is there's the effects of ingredients and how you value those in the pigs can really make a difference in how you formulate diets and then how you set your recommendations.
Zach, anything to add there from a poultry perspective? I know you guys probably believe you're leading the way in amino acid nutrition.
Yeah, I was to say we actually I was adding to that. I mean, granted, now I'm not out in industry as much, so I don't get to do all the fun experiments. But at Balchem, we're actually clearly a choline company, so we've been doing quite a bit of research on choline and looking at how requirements have changed within broilers. Hopefully, we'll get to pigs. But and not only in the animals, but we've actually been doing a lot of work with the feed stuff and seeing how the actual crops have changed because they're under the same selections, bigger, faster growing, more production. And we saw a change in the amount of choline that's actually in the crops.
I'm curious. Can I ask a question? Is that okay?
Absolutely.
So I'm really curious as to how crops have changed over time. Are there any general statements you can make about energy, protein content, those types of things, especially corn?
I would say so. We actually did. We looked at 4 different things. We looked at DDGs, wheat, soybean, and corn, and we mainly focused on the choline on it. But yeah, we saw pretty significant reductions in the amount of choline versus what the NRC from the last poultry one was 1994. So it's significantly lower than a lot of people were kind of the numbers that people were using.
Zach, to kind of build on that, not only has the crops changed, but the animals changed and the requirements for those nutrients have changed. And I know that you've recently completed some research at, was it Auburn University?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can you touch on that a bit? Are we allowed to do that?
I don't know, but we'll see, and if we aren't, we'll cut it out. um, but yeah, no, we saw we did a choline titration trial in broilers, and as you know, there's probably similar in pigs. There's two main broiler companies. There's the Cobb Genetics and there's the Avogen, and the current one was with Avogen birds. But I would assume a similar response. But we saw, I mean, we started all the way from no added choline all the way up to 2,000 ppm added, and we saw a linear increase in breast meat and a linear decrease in feed conversion. It was almost a perfect line. So it's definitely some different requirements for these birds. We're hoping to do a couple more to look at some different aspects and kind of push the range and see where we need to be at. But
yeah, it's interesting because one thing we talk about, and one I think the crop has really changed, is when you look at soybeans, and we know the percent of oil and protein in those beans before the process differs from Minnesota to Dakotas and to Iowa, just by their growing areas and growing regions and degree days. That I think we're probably leaving some money on the table by not looking at soybean meal by plant, instead of just kind of considering it to be one protein, one amino acid level.
and also, it was interesting. So the wheat was probably the least different. It had the least change in it. And if you think about it, it's not quite as selected, and there's not as many GMOs and different variations of it compared to the corn and soybeans, which had the largest discrepancy in choline.
It makes you wonder, with Tom talking about the genetics rapidly changing and these animals, are we going to have to take a look at all the nutrients that we're giving them and maximizing it for the current genetic makeup of those animals? Just kind of curious.
Yeah, at least in the swine, I think, we talk about other amino acids, but we always ratio those off to lysine. So we have an assumption that if our lysine levels are correct, then if we ratio the other amino acids, then we're really in the ballpark. Whether that's right or wrong, because we know different breeds and different genetics have different feed intakes and different performance and different lean gain. There's just so much variation, or much more variation in the swine side than what you'd see in the poultry, from producer to producer, to probably be more defined. But I think that day could probably come, especially as these companies get more integrated with packing and gets more information back.
I was even thinking about minerals. When's the last time we've taken a look at mineral requirements in these animals? I mean, I don't know. I don't know if you guys have an idea of that or not. I know that the poultry people are looking to update the NRC here soon, and I'm sure they'll address it there. Not sure about the swine folks.
We're way behind. So a lot of the vitamin mineral requirements from swine, NRC goes back decades. So when you look at that from a requirement standpoint, I think there's still a lot of work to do, but it's just it's generating the funds and things to do at that level. Private industry probably is not a great place to look at that, but it might have to be done at a university level to really get to the bottom of that. And just finding the people that want to study that for 5 years or so, it can be a little bit difficult. But we go back and forth from a sulfur or inorganic mineral to an organic mineral, and what's best to use, especially in some of our high value animals, like our gilt developer animals, that are going to be the base for your sow herd. And even within the sow herd, we think that we could use a higher value organic mineral at levels. I don't think they need to be formulated to the same levels that we have our inorganics, but we know they're much more absorbed than your inorganic, and but we need to have more information once they're in the body, how they're interacting and what they're actually doing.
If we could kind of maybe switch gears just a little bit, Balchem sponsored a symposia on epigenetics in dairy cattle. And I'm curious, Tom, do you take that into consideration? I'm going to back up just a little bit. There was a presentation there done by Dr. Chad Deckow from Penn State University, and he had a picture of the world record holding dairy cow from this past couple years. And from a genomic perspective, this animal was below average. And so the thinking is, right, there was some epigenetics at play here. And so just kind of curious about your comments relative to epigenetics and the role it plays in your operation.
So that's a really interesting question. And I have a couple of examples I'd like to throw out there where we would see an effect, I think, like that. And it's a true mystery for us. So let me back up a little bit. So if you're making genetic improvement, you're really selecting on the additive genetic variation. So what genes that animal has and how they contribute to its performance. When at least the definition I would use of epigenetics is you're perhaps, and maybe a cow model is easier, you're saying, well, if depending on how I feed this beef cow, I'm going to impact her calf that's now a replacement in my herd. So you're actually probably modifying the genetic expression through some kind of environmental factor. By definition, we can't really take account of that in a breeding program. Now, I may be proven wrong about that, and maybe we need to in some way, shape, or form, but certainly it's not something you can select for, but it's something you need to understand, because perhaps that could result in recommendations for producers and so on. Jason mentioned gilt development. So how do we properly develop these gilts to really set up them and their offspring for future success? So that's where I think it can come into play. But within our own selection program, we have examples of, for example, Duroc boars that at 22 weeks of age have come off tests at nearly 380 pounds. So that pig, if you do the math on that, I'm doing it in my head, but that pig would have grown over 3 pounds a day since birth. How does that happen? Normally that's a high ranking animal, but it may not be. So how do you get those outliers, and what was different for that pig compared to others? And I think that's where that epigenetic question could come in, is that you see these animals with really great performance that are just outside the norm. Genetically, you're going to identify those, but then there's some other factor there. There definitely is some other factor there that's maybe not a inherited component, and we need to understand that better. So I don't have a deep answer for you on that question, but I do think we see it, and you'll see it in those real outliers in your populations.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. Another one of the speakers was Dr. Pete Hansen from University of Florida. And I remember one of his comments was that, you're impacting, well, his research was on the gene methylation of the 1 or 2 a day old embryo. And he had done a lot of in vitro research. But anyway, he was talking about the ability to impact 3 generations, the animal that you're feeding the nutrient to, and the calf that the animal's carrying, and then the gonads, which impacts the next generation. So it's a fascinating topic, and one maybe we'll have to explore here sometime down the road.
Yeah, if there's one thing that's true about genetics, we don't know what we don't know.
Yeah.
And 20 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about these things.
Right.
When I was in graduate school, and I won't say when that is, but you can maybe figure that out. That's when really genomics first started. And I remember people saying, and this would have been in the early 90s, saying that, well, by the end of the decade, we won't have to measure any phenotypes. We're going to know the genotypes. We're going to know performance. And that's proven to be so far from the truth. And the more time that goes on, the more we learn about the complexity of the genome, what's turned on, what's not turned on. All of these things, it's just a rich area of research. So it's exciting to begin to understand those and be able to hopefully have those help us.
Mm-hmm.
Going with that, you mentioned that you rely heavily on genomic selection. How heavily do you rely on that versus the actual phenotype of the offspring? or
So,
parent?
yeah, so I mean, basically, we're so we use a single step genomic prediction. So basically, we're incorporating genomics into that relationship matrix, that underlying relationship matrix. So we're not actually estimating an allele effect, if you will, and then combining that with the phenotype. It's all one analysis. And so from that standpoint, the jump in accuracy of that 25 to 40%, I mean, that would tell you the impact that it's had on the program, but you're really using it in that, we're using it in that fashion versus, having a separate analysis that we're trying to combine.
All right, maybe change some gears here. Tom, I'd like to kind of circle back, to one of the topics you addressed in your webinar, which is your 14-14-21 program. Can you give us some background on that and why that's important?
Yeah, I sure can. We, about a decade ago, we really kind of sat down as a team and talked to our customers. We gathered as much information as we could to really understand what the future direction needed to be for a maternal program. And what we heard from the industry at that point in time is that, labor is continuing to be a bigger challenge. And it's almost impossible to have a conversation with a producer today or a customer and have them not bring up labor as their biggest challenge. So when you think about that in terms of a selection program, we can certainly create a lot of genetic potential, but your level of management to extract that's not going up, it's going down. So we have to produce an animal that's more self-reliant, more self-sufficient, able to really produce, and in terms of our sow, produce and wean pigs on her own. And so a big part of 14-14 was really to identify those sows that have that ability to wean 14-pound pigs, 21 days on her own. So that was a big driver there. Certainly, we want a pig that's high quality, and what I mean by that is it's born at a healthy weight. It's going to nurse well. It's going to go on to wean and survive. We don't have people to run extensive fostering programs on farms to try and save more pigs. We need sows that can really lactate these pigs on her own and go on to wean those. So that was a big driver for us. And then just, looking at the complete farrow to finish model in terms of what really optimizes that whole system and what's the sow farm's contribution. So it's the sow farm, you want to produce more pigs, but those pigs go on into finishing. So you have to look at the whole picture and really understand the quality of the animal, how that impacts your grow finish costs. And that makes you think a little bit different about what you want your sows to do. So that's really the basis for that from a kind of a big picture standpoint. But those were the key drivers for us putting that program together.
Mm-hmm. Building on that, during your webinar, you mentioned that sow nutrition is one of the areas that's hardest to research. And, it's one of the areas that's most lacking in terms of data. I kind of like to ask Jason, how are you dealing with that?
Well, it is. It's really hard to get data and just research into sow farms, just because there's so many moving parts of it that can confound your results. So you got areas from health to you still got to treat a research farm like a commercial farm. So you're going to meet breeding targets and so forth like that. And ultimately, the pigs have to go out the door at some point. So from a nutritional standpoint, the way we look at that is we try to control the body condition of the sow in gestation, and feed to more of the level of the sow and get her an appropriate body level that we think is going to maximize intake and lactation. And that kind of just keeps playing off on each other, where we minimize the fat accretion in gestation and hope or think that that's going to drive feed intake during that lactational period. And then once we know that feed intake, we can base a lot of our nutritional recommendations off of that. Because really, when we look at from a lactating sow in the farrowing house, that production with the growth rate of the pig and how many pigs she has is going to drive your lysine needs for milk production. You can kind of debate, well, maybe we should set lysine levels to where they're actually gaining protein too as well, because some of that weight does have value to commercial farm. But at this standpoint, I don't think we're quite there to be able to quantify that area. So we're trying to set that basically to maximize production in the wean pig and in weaning weight. Paint everything with the broad stroke brush, and and not a lot of producers from a commercial standpoint will actually track or know what their feed intake is. So it's a struggle. It really is.
So going back to the 14 and 14, I think that's interesting because there is a kind of an experimental selection program that was made up looking at early exponential and late exponential growth in poultry. And for the early exponential growth, you actually look at 14-day body weights. And those typically tend to be your more, I guess, maternal lines. So they're usually the best egg producers, good fertility, laying ability, more feed efficient. And then the late exponential growth is kind of more where your male lines come from. So I thought that was interesting that that it's also going along with, I guess, improved piglet numbers and that type thing.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you make, because maybe let's just segue a little bit into the grow finish side, because one of the things that I think that's a bit of a quandary, right? So if you want a pig that has extremely strong early life performance, that's a different animal than the one that's going to finish in pigs anyway at 300 pounds and really efficiently, because there's certainly genetic lines out there that, if you did a sire line trial and stopped at the end of the nursery, you would obviously choose one or the other, but then you'd carry that on into finish and you would completely flip your decision. So I think how those growth curves are put together has definitely changed over time. My personal theory is that if we, for years, have selected for a lean pig at a heavy market weight, so that's what the industry wants and has wanted or desired for a long time. So if that's a 290 or 300 pound pig, what you would actually be doing is you want a pig that has maximal growth to that end point and still remains lean, has the cutability that we're after. So basically you're pushing maturity out. You're pushing that growth curve out further, probably creating maybe a larger animal, maybe an animal that matures later in life. So I think those are all implications of how we've selected this animal. Certainly have implications for how we're feeding the animal. But those growth curves have changed. So early life growth doesn't look the same as it did 30 years ago and 20 years ago. And I think that's a consequence of what the industry's wanted. But I admire my colleagues in poultry, because you can have that 6-week bird and is it a 12-week bird? I can't remember what those are, but there's big differences in those programs.
Yeah, and even though that the growth pattern has changed, we know we can still alter some of that by nutritional processes and using more expensive ingredients, more palatable ingredients in early nursery. It's just a matter of are they going to pay for themselves? And I think the old adage is if they have an extra pound coming out of nursery that's going to carry forward into finishing or even multiply off of that. And I don't know if that's always the case. It just matters if that's based on if you're doing that through a nutritional process or if it's actually a genetic process. And then what Tom said with the eating patterns, some of these pigs, I mean, in our research barn, it's not uncommon to get 6.5 pounds of feed intake at 150 pound body weight. It's just phenomenal what these pigs will sit down and eat.
So as y'all select for more and more rapid growth, as the poultry have also been doing, we've clearly had some issues that you run into. Nutritionists blame geneticists, and the geneticists blame the nutritionist. But anyway, it typically comes back to rapid growth from whichever side you're coming from. But stuff like tibial disc chondroplasia or ascites, and more recently, I think woody breast and white striping. Are y'all having issues such as that in pigs?
We haven't seen the equivalent to woody breast, at least to my knowledge, and certainly not in the lines that we're working with. I do think, though, that you know, the interaction between nutrition and you know, nutrition, genetics, and then skeletal integrity is something that we need to always be aware of and understand. I would say that, you know, the pigs probably haven't gone as far as poultry in terms of the genetic response that might trigger some of those issues, but I do think that's probably part of our future, and we'll want to learn from the poultry guys on how to deal with that. But you know, it's the growth rate these pigs have. It's like the, you know, the 6-foot 8th grader type of syndrome. You know, they're growing extremely fast. You have to, you know, hopefully have, you know, adequate nutrient availability, but there's also this just genetic component to it, I think, as well, where you have fast growth, the skeletal structure has to keep up and everything associated with that. So those are all, you know, issues that are on our minds, and you do tend to select against some of those pigs that have those issues because they don't go on to be selected at the nucleus level. You know, there's a certain amount of culling that takes place with those animals that don't have that structural integrity. So there's some of that pressure going on, but yeah, I appreciate the question, and I think it's something we need to be aware of.
Yeah, on the at least for the pigs and the carcass standpoint, for carcass, you know, meat, fat quality, our biggest issue has been more on the fat quality side, and that's more of a nutritional problem where feeding highly unsaturated fatty acids, and can be due more so to the ethanols policy that we have in feeding distillers with high amount of corn oil nowadays. So the nutrition part is probably a little bit more to blame on any carcass quality issues that we're having nowadays. But I agree with Tom. It's, you know, we need to be mindful of how this growth rate is actually affecting how these pigs move and function and still be productive in some of these finishing units.
Kind of circling back, Tom, you had mentioned that you wanted I think you said a 309-pound pig, and you wanted them very lean. Um, is What do you see changing going forward? Are we going to keep getting bigger and bigger? Or we gotten to the size that we want? And then what's driving that size? Is it the consumer's desire for a certain size meat cut, or is it, you know, the packers and what they can manage? I know I ask a lot of questions there. Let's
Yeah,
go with that.
no, I think a great question, and I can only really share kind of the feedback we've gotten from different customers and different aspects of the industry. So I don't want to claim to be an expert in any of those areas. But certainly when we look at pig size, we're seeing that increase over time. So the same as you would optimize throughput in a grow finish system with the tonnage of pork or pig that you can push through that system. You know, I think when you look at the packing industry, it's a very similar economics. So, you know, if you can have a larger pig coming in, each rail in that just carries that much more product. So I think from that standpoint, there's this economic incentive to push weights higher. I think we'll continue to see that, but the flip side of that is that you know, I know people have shared with us that the consumer, or, you know, whoever that is, not necessarily you and I that are going to the grocery store, but people that are buying in bulk for food service and those types of things, you know, you hear complaints of cuts being too big now. So I think there's a bit of back and forth that's starting to occur on pig size, and I don't know where that's going to end up. Usually, you know, economics tend to rule the day, but certainly we're still expecting a trend for heavier pigs, and I don't really know if I can predict where that'll stop, but 290 is pretty typical today, and, you know, going up over 300 I know has been looked at by folks and seems to be very economical as well. So I think that's part of it. One thing I do see changing, though, is we're seeing a lot more. Of course, we've had integration for a while with different groups that own both production and packing, but we're also seeing more producers that are forward integrating into packing. And the implication of that for us as a company is that historically our pig has really been designed for our direct customer who's a pork producer to drop that pig off at the plant. So you want a pig that's efficient, that grows quickly, and that meets the cutability matrix that maximizes their payout. Once you have ownership in packing, now things like meat quality become more important to you, because there's no economic incentive to do that today, other than a packer saying, if you don't, we're not taking your pigs. But I think we may see that start to evolve here over the next decade, and we're going to start hearing more talk about meat quality. I think as a company we need to pay attention to that, and that could impact how we select our sire line, for example. And so we're very engaged in those conversations, and definitely see the industry as a whole has already moved to a Duroc sire, and I think the reason for that is that the Duroc sire, compared to Pietrin or Hampshire-based sires, brings more meat quality. So packers have recognized that. Now the question is, how do we differentiate within the Durocs that are available to us? And so that's where you're going to get into, higher quality cuts coming in the plant, maybe specific labels put on those or brands. I think all of those things are going to be part of the future.
Our industry's gotten very good at, growing high quality protein very inexpensively. And I do wonder if there is an opportunity to at least, carve out some niches to differentiate ourselves, right? We've got a little farm market here that sells some obscure breed from Europe because it supposedly tastes better. And then there's another one down the way that sells Berkshire, right? Because it supposedly tastes better. And I can only assume that has to do with fat quality and fat content. But it just seems like maybe there's not been a lot of emphasis put on, the actual aesthetics and taste of the meats. So
yeah, and there's been some groups that are individual producers or small groups of producers that have carved out really nice niches for themselves, with a really high quality product that's differentiated. And I think those opportunities are there for people that want to pursue those and can market that. I think in the broader industry, of course, you're dealing with a lot more volume, but certainly differentiation in those products would occur as well. That doesn't preclude some of the smaller niche markets, but hopefully brings a better eating experience to have pork just compete well with beef and the other options that are out there.
While we're on the subject of consumers, are there any other consumer implications to deal with from either a nutritional perspective or genetic perspective?
Well, I think from a consumer or industry product issues right now we're seeing is more on the welfare side, where we see more of the Prop 12 space issues. So it's a little bit more so on the economics of what producers have to go through to produce a viable product. Now, with that, we've gone from gestating stalls to group housing to larger pen size. So I think some of the areas that we need to look at, or at least be mindful of in the near future, is just how the behavior of some of these animals change as we make genetic improvements. So when we look at the different purebreds lines that we have on test between the York and Landrace and Duroc, we know that they have different eating patterns. So with the Duroc having, being a large intake, large gorger, but may go to the feeder fewer times a day versus a Yorkshire who will nibble so many times, but they'll go back 10 times a day. So, figuring out some of those eating patterns and how they apply to raising a better pig, and how producers can actually use that or understand that in the field.
Kind of along those same lines, we in agriculture are going to be charged with the challenge of feeding an ever-growing population, right? And not only feeding them, but feeding them sustainably. So are those considerations you guys think about either from a genetic or nutritional perspective? And if so, what are they?
Yeah, I think when we think of the sustainability story, I think the pork industry even today has a tremendous story to tell. Um, I know the pork board has figures on that over the last 30, 40, 50 years on the changes that have taken place. So if you think of something like feed efficiency and what that does to reduce um, the amount of land required to raise a pound of pork, that gets into the amount of water used and so on. So all of those things have really strong, very desirable trends that have made a tremendous contribution to sustainability already. Certainly, we want to continue those. Um, I think some other areas of research that we're engaged in is, for example, trying to select an animal that's more resilient to the challenges that it faces in the normal production system, particularly with disease challenge. And so, if we can select a more resilient animal that's more able to, perhaps survive and thrive even when exposed to kind of a normal level of pathogens, those things I think are useful because they reduce antibiotic use. Which is a public concern, I think, amongst some groups, and uh, has a direct impact on those things. So, there are areas that, anytime we're making genetic improvement, I know I'm probably coming from a biased standpoint here, but anytime we improve efficiency and anytime we can improve more output with less input, we're having a huge impact on sustainability. It's a great story to tell. We don't do as good a job as an industry in getting that story out.
Well, one thing Tom hasn't talked about was just what we've looked at from a survivability trait perspective, and the biggest sustainability area that we could increase is reducing mortality. So if we can affect mortality or increase survivability through our genetic selection index, that's a huge saver from less inputs to create the same amount of pork produced. From a nutrition standpoint, we're always looking to use less and get out more. So I think we can, from a diet standpoint, we can use more crystalline amino acids and reduce the amount of nitrogen that's wasted or not being utilized by the pig and that goes in the pits. What we kind of run up against is right now is we need a minimum amount or minimum level of crude protein in the diet. Otherwise, we are affecting performance, and that goes back to what we don't know on what are amino acid levels or amino acid requirements. And we may actually figure out that we need a certain amount of nitrogen for the pig to synthesize other non-essential amino acids within the body. So, amino acids that we didn't need to provide through the diet before, and then maybe we need to do that in the future if we're going to bring that crude protein down even more. A little bit on the flip side of that, and I know we talked about crops earlier, but there's some research out there that actually shows that soybean meal provides some benefits, especially in a low health environment. So on the flip side, if we have a health outbreak, we might actually want to use more soybean meal and more crude protein within that diet to actually help some of these pigs get through a disease outbreak.
Speaking of health, that's one topic I don't want to miss before we close here. But what's taking place from a genetic perspective to mitigate disease?
I'm struggling to answer that just from a couple different directions. So, as far as mitigating disease, when you look at the health that we need to maintain at our nucleus level, there's been a tremendous amount of work done on biosecurity and all the steps that we have to take to secure those sites to ensure we don't have any fomite or direct transfer of any disease. We're doing a lot of filtration at most of our nucleus sites so that you're also, through a HEPA filter, keeping the air going in, filtered from any outside viruses. So if that's the part, that might be part of your question there as well, is the work that's been done there that's been really critical for us. But from a disease mitigation standpoint, the One of the things that we've actually implemented just recently in our Duroc selection program is selecting to improve survivability. So we've been able to demonstrate that, while the heritabilities are low, they're on about the same level as litter size. So we know we can make some genetic improvement, but there are differences amongst sires in the survivability of their offspring. We can measure that in a very general basis just by looking at survival rates of offspring of sires in commercial environments that are somewhat challenged. And that is a trait that we put into our index directly to try and it will identify those sires that have more robust offspring. So that's a mitigation strategy. I think that's got a long-term path to it. But those are some of the key areas that we would have been focused on, both from preventing disease, if you will, or just preventing its transfer into a farm and preserving those farms for future genetic progress, but also in the pig itself as the offspring go out into the real world and have to deal with pathogens, creating a more robust animal.
Yeah, I was kind of thinking more specifically, is there anything that you're doing from a genomics perspective to look at improving specifically the innate or adaptive immune systems? Have we gotten that far along yet in identifying, those specific genes? And then from a nutritional perspective, how do we turn them on and off?
Yeah, I can take the genetic question first, Jason, but we have been involved in some research just in the last few years with a research consortium that we're part of, where we've looked at pigs that have been through a disease challenge model. And what that's allowed us to do is to, basically look at the activation of the immune system and look at various, parameters from a blood sample, for example, or in tissues. And then look at the genes that might be turned on. And of course, a lot of those, as you might expect, are associated with a major histocompatibility complex. So really a lot of alleles that are likely associated with the immune system directly. There appears to be elements of the innate immune system that are also associated with resilience to disease. I would say from my perspective that was a tremendous project. We've learned a lot from it. Now we got to figure out how to implement it. So we're starting to learn more about the underlying biology. When you think back on what I said earlier about selecting for just survivability, we're likely going after those alleles through a phenotypic trait. But I think understanding that underlying biology is going to make us much more precise. And I think that's a future endeavor as we go forward.
Say in poultry, they, I don't know if they necessarily do it so much commercially, but I know there's been a lot of research and there's several lines that are selected for and against certain diseases for susceptibility and resistance. And one of the most, I guess, probably the most famous one is from a geneticist that's been around forever, Paul Siegel at Virginia Tech. And he's selected on just antibody production, and it's to sheep red blood cells. And I think he's been doing this for, I'm thinking, almost 50 years, and the lines are still going. And he's still breeding them and still selecting them. And it's kind of interesting to look at the offspring between the two, because your high antibody, your HASLAS line are usually a lot smaller, and your low antibody productions are usually kind of bigger. So it's interesting to, I think the main takeaway is that it's resource allocation, but it's just it's interesting how you can select for that much divergence out of a random bred population.
Yeah. The goal in production is to not turn on the immune system, right? Because it costs energy. And but yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. That's kind of the direction those lines would go. But there's obviously, the thing with genetics too is there's always a balance, right? We can't go too extreme in any one direction. So I think as we learn things, particularly, the immune system's a lot harder to measure. We can't just go out and weigh a pig and have it's an indirect measure maybe of immune system function, but we have to be able to get some kind of phenotype. Those are they're hard to get. They're expensive to measure, but I do believe that there are opportunities there, and they're probably not forefront today, but they're being developed.
Gentlemen, as we wind down here, I'd kind of like you to take a look into your crystal balls. Imagine the pig of 2050. And Tom, what does that pig look like from a genetic perspective, a phenotypic perspective, and how are you going to get there? And then, Jason, how in the world are you going to feed him?
That is the hardest question I've had all day. 2050 is a long time from now. But one thing that genetics has never done is really failed to achieve. And what I mean by that is if we think of things like litter size, there's people that, used to think when we got to 12 pigs per litter, we were at an optimum, if you will. But the animal continues to prove us wrong. So I think when we think of the future, we're going to be able to create female lines that, are going to give birth to and wean, 95% of the pigs that they give birth to. They're going to be at a heavy weaning weight and just continue to perform through finishing. I think if you think that far ahead, though, there's other things that are going to have entered the picture. We talked about disease. I think we're going to have lines that are resistant to different diseases, either through selection or potentially even through a gene editing approach. And there's lots of opportunity there with editing. It's a matter really of consumer acceptance of that product and how we define that. But I think that's a tool that we're going to use specifically for disease to start with. And then there's probably going to be other applications to really speed up the process. So I guess my vision would be a pig that's highly resistant and thrives in the environment that we provide for it. We're going to have reduced mortality to minimal levels. I think if I had a 30-year crystal ball, that's where we'd end.
Well, from a nutrition standpoint, I think we're going to be able to be much more detailed in feeding these pigs. Whether it's, instead of feeding one lactation diet to your whole sow farm, maybe we'll have a couple of different feed lines to feed different diets at different stages in that production. And when you talk about a little bit beyond the scope of this talk here, from a feed milling standpoint, there's a lot of neat things going on with sensors and inline NIR testing that we can get an ingredient analysis back quicker and more accurate, so we can formulate these diets much more precise. So we're not overfeeding or underfeeding at certain points of those pigs' life. And I think just the overall acceptance of technology in the barns, from simple cameras in the barns, that's going to help us determine the size of these pigs and the health of these pigs and how to feed them differently from that standpoint. And one thing I do see a lot more swine nutrition graduate students in school here today than I did during my time period. So I think we're having a lot more younger group coming through that's going to bring a lot more ideas or fresher ideas to the industry. And I think that's something that's very good for the swine industry in total.
Our last call question is brought to you tonight by Puricol. Look to Puricol choline chloride from Balchem to deliver the highest standards of quality, backed by the strictest process controls, for a level of purity, safety, and consistency you won't find anywhere else.
Guys, they just called last call. That means I'm going to get another drink. I don't know about you guys, but as we wind it down here, I'd like for each of you, all three of you, to give us 1-2 key takeaway items that either an integrator or a nutritionist can take home and learn from today. So, Jason, why don't we start with you?
Well, I hope people can take home today that we're making improvements to this pig every day, and that's going to change the way that we feed it. And we're going to bring information to you, and hopefully information that's going to help you make your production and your system better. And we're going to keep bringing the best pig and the best people, the best genetic progress forward.
Thank you. Zach?
I guess the takeaway would be that I think genetics in all species, for that matter, are always changing, and to meet the consumer demands and to supply the increasing food supply that we need. I think it's going to be a never-ending thing.
Mm-hmm. Tom, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think one thing I'd like to leave the audience with is that as a genetic supplier, we really strive to understand what does the industry need in the future, and what are the issues we face today with the animals we work with. Is there a genetic solution for improving those? And just to be, just to know that your voice matters. And if we look to the opportunities, whether it be with the female line, with the terminal sire line, we talked a little bit about meat quality today and potential impact there. There's just a lot of opportunity out there, and genetics is kind of that base, if you will, that we can build from. So just know that there's a listening ear, and we're working hard to make the pig better every day, as Jason mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Good. So, gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming today. This has been very enlightening. I've enjoyed it immensely. Appreciate learning about the impact that genetics is going to have on our lives. This is exciting stuff, and I'm sure that we're going to be addressing this in future webinars and future podcasts, and I hope to see you guys here once again at the Real Science Exchange. I'd also like to thank our loyal listeners for joining us once again. I got to admit, this is one of my favorite parts of the week, to be able to sit down with everyone here and, have a nice, relaxing drink and talk animal science. It's a lot of fun. So we hope to see you next time here at the Real Science Exchange, where it's always happy hour and you're always among friends.
We'd love to hear your comments or ideas for topics and guests. So please reach out via email to anh.marketing@balchem.com with any suggestions, and we'll work hard to add them to the schedule. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating on your way out. You can request your Real Science Exchange t-shirt in just a few easy steps. Just like or subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size to anh.marketing@balchem.com. Balchem's Real Science Lecture Series of webinars continues with ruminant-focused topics on the first Tuesday of every month, monogastric-focused topics on the second Tuesday of each month, and quarterly topics for the companion animal segment. Visit balchem.com/realscience to see the latest schedule and to register for upcoming webinars.